We heard Senate Majority Leader Reid say a short time ago to expect a series of 4 votes tomorrow related to the funding bill, with those votes starting at about 12:30 Eastern Time. In addition to our live Senate coverage tomorrow, we'll also have live coverage of a Center for American Progress event on women's economic security, including remarks from Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. That's live on C-SPAN 3 at 10:30 Eastern.
The senator from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today on behalf of the millions of middle-class families across America who feel like they've been left behind. Too many of these people are decent, hardworking folks who are unemployed or underemployed. Too many have adult children stuck living at home because despite graduating from college, they're struggling to find work. And now, because of Obamacare, these same young adults, many of whom are older than 26, will be forced to pay more taxes or purchase costly government-defined health insurance. In spite of the administration's best salesmanship, the law remains extremely unpopular. A poll conducted by the Omaha World Herald last fall showed 55% of registered voters still favored the full repeal of Obamacare. Recent national polls indicate a similar disapproval rating for the law all across the country. Part of the reason for the public's continued opposition is the harm that Obamacare is causing our economy. Let me share a story of one woman, a small business owner named Eileen Marison. I had the pleasure of meeting Eileen in August when I was traveling my state, and I visited with her in Papillion, Nebraska. The Marison family owns and operates 2 Men and a Truck. Those are franchises in Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska. They have 30 employees in Lincoln. They have 76 in Omaha. And the Marisons provide paychecks for local families, and they have earned the respect of their communities. Eileen Marison, the matriarch of the family, presently offers health insurance to full-time employees, 36 individuals working 35 to 40 hours per week. And she foots more than half the cost of that coverage. Since Obamacare changes the definition of a full-time employee, lowering the threshold to 30 hours per week from 40 hours, Eileen now employs 76 full-time equivalents, triggering the employer mandate. Now she must offer affordable coverage, as defined by Obamacare. And she has to offer that to all her employees working 30 hours or more. Eileen has been taking care of her employees for years, and she wants to continue to do so. However, Obamacare's mandate is now placing additional burdens on this family business, requiring Eileen to make tough decisions or incur those harmful costs. I've received thousands of phone calls, emails, and letters echoing Eileen's concerns and urging me to repeal all or pieces of the law. Another constituent, a 61-year-old retired school teacher from Beatrice, Nebraska, recently wrote me to share that he had just received a letter from his insurance carrier. The news was that premiums were set to spike 60% to $939 a month. That is half of his monthly pension check. He says, "We are dismayed and disappointed." Another Nebraskan, Roger from Hardington, Nebraska, wrote, "I just wanted to let you know I got my letter from Blue Cross of Nebraska. My premium went up $160 per month, and my total out-of-pocket risk increased from $5,000 to $12,700. Roger continued, "On the positive side, my menopausal wife and I now have maternity, drug, alcohol, pediatric, dental, and vision care. President Obama promised our costs would go down and we could keep our insurance if we liked it. I liked my old plan. I want it back. You know, we no longer have to rely on these testimonials to prove that Obamacare is driving up the price of insurance premiums. Yesterday, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services released its long-awaited report on Obamacare, premium prices offered on the exchanges. The numbers for Nebraska proved that premiums will rise dramatically. In its analysis of the data, Forbes magazine published an article noting there was a 279% increase when comparing the cheapest plans offered to Nebraska men. For Nebraska women, there was a 227% increase when comparing the cheapest plans. That's more than triple the current rate. Those numbers, Mr. President, are absolutely staggering. The average premium for a 27-year-old for the most basic plan, the bronze plan, is $159 before tax credits. Currently, that same 27-year-old, he can find a premium for $68 in Nebraska. So we're looking at a significant increase in cost. Based on a Manhattan Institute analysis of the report, quote, Obamacare will increase underlying insurance rates for younger men by an average of 97 to 99%, and for younger women by an average of 55 to 62%. Despite these high rates, the plans include fewer in-network doctors and hospitals than current plans. And many of those lowest cost plans will likely carry high deductibles. One insurer found that, quote, for the cheapest bronze plans, the average deductible was $5,000. Now, how is that possibly affordable? In August, the administration announced another major delay, this time to the part of the health care law limiting patients' out-of-pocket expenses. Rather than capping costs for individuals and families as required by the law, the delay of this key provision guarantees Obamacare will be anything but affordable. Of course, there are many other problems with the law beyond the increases in premiums, which is why I have been promoting the complete repeal of the law, and I support defunding it. For example, there are serious concerns about possible identity theft for those participating in the new health exchanges. Why? Because the administration failed to independently test the security for its Federal Data Services Hub, which will store huge amounts of people's private personal information. The report released by the Department of Health and Human Services Inspectors General stated that, quote, several critical tasks remain to be completed in such a short period of time, such as the final independent testing of the hub's security controls, remediating security vulnerabilities identified during testing, and obtaining the security authorization decision for the hub before opening the exchanges. The administration has until this Tuesday to complete these critical tasks. I, for one, remain skeptical that these tasks will be completed in time, opening up security risks for individuals who do participate in the exchanges. Just today, the administration tactically admitted once again that Obamacare is not ready for prime time when it announced another delay, this time postponing online enrollment in some of the small business exchanges scheduled to open on Tuesday. The irony, of course, is that news of this latest delay broke as the President was delivering a speech criticizing Republicans for their effort to defund or delay the law altogether. It seems reasonable to ask, where's the delay for the American people? Where's the delay for middle-class citizens like the 61-year-old retired teacher from Beatrice, Nebraska? Is that really an extreme position? I certainly don't think so. In short, this law remains fatally flawed. The American people deserve better than selective delays, unfair treatment, and broken promises. For me, the fight over Obamacare has nothing to do with politics or with ideology. It has to do with standing up for small business owners like Eileen Morrison. It's about standing up for middle-class families who aren't asking government for a hand-up. They're just asking that government stop holding them down. We are a country that looks to build a brighter future for our people. We are a country who looks to help and lift up people. This is what America is all about. It's about giving voice to millions of Americans, those middle-class families who are feeling left behind, who would rather have the federal government focusing on ways to create jobs so that they can bring home a decent paycheck. Let me be perfectly clear. I have no intention of standing down in this fight. It's why I was sent here. It's what Nebraskans expect from me. And it's the only way, it is the only way that we will ever be able to turn our economy around and build that brighter future for all Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, thank you. I come here this evening with no notes, hopefully able to communicate my feelings, my concerns from the heart, from the brain, about the task that we are about. And while we've been focused so much on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and rightfully so, I consider it one of the most damaging pieces of legislation ever to pass a Congress and be signed by a president, I want to start by at least pointing out something that's receiving, in my view, inadequate attention. We are back on the Senate floor with a continuing resolution. It's almost as if passing a continuing resolution has become, it has become the norm. It's almost as if it's become a way of life. I have the privilege of serving on the Appropriations Committee. The task that we have, what I would consider a very basic task, is to pass a budget. This is the first time the Senate in almost 4 years has passed a budget. The House has passed a budget, but yet no reconciliation, no effort to conference, I guess no success in the effort to conference that bill. And so we have no budget framework to go by. And then the other requirement, again, one that ought to be so basic to the ability of Americans to be governed by an elected Congress, is then to pass appropriation bills within that budgetary framework. We're here almost on September 30th, and I would remind my colleagues that not one appropriation bill out of the 13 appropriation bills that should be passed by September 30th has passed the United States Senate. And so it seems to me important to highlight the fact that this place, once again, is failing to do its job. Not one appropriation bill out of 13. And why is that important? Passing a continuing resolution, if we just do that at will, what it means is that the Appropriations Committee in the United States Senate, on behalf of the American people, are never required to prioritize our spending. Does anyone not think that the priorities of this Congress should have changed from last year to this year? Have things not changed in our country in which, if we were doing our work, we would decide how much money each program should receive based upon its effectiveness, its efficiency, its whether or not it's a proper role for the federal government, the changing nature, economy, environment of our country? And yet, no, one more time, we're here to pass a continuing resolution. And the thing that troubles me perhaps the most about this topic, it's just a given. We're not complaining about the passage of a continuing resolution. We are focused on a very significant provision in that continuing resolution that very well may be removed tomorrow when the Senate acts. The Appropriations Committee needs to work. Just as if we always raise the debt ceiling every time the debt ceiling is met, if we always agree to raise the debt ceiling, what's the effect of a debt ceiling? If we always, every year, pass a continuing resolution, why have an appropriations process in which we are to establish priorities on behalf of the American people, how their tax dollars are spent? We're failing miserably, once again, the American people, and it is just happening as if it is of no consequence. I want the appropriations process to work. I want to eliminate funding for some programs that aren't our business. Federal government should never have been involved in the first place. I want us to establish the amount of money that we can afford to spend on programs within the federal agencies and departments. And it may be true that there are some things that we may want to spend more money on. I would remind our colleagues that, in my view, the primary responsibility of the federal government is to defend our country. And what we do in regard to defense spending has a huge consequence upon our ability to fulfill that vital mission, that constitutional responsibility. We take on too many things here to deal with. I've always believed the view that if the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution had ever been enforced in the way that I or most Kansans would consider its words to mean, that our federal government and our lives, more importantly, our lives would be so much different in the United States. The 10th Amendment says all those powers not specifically granted to the federal government are hereby reserved to the states and the people. And yet government continues to grow, and we have an appropriations process that's failed to do anything about curbing that spending. Now, the issue that is front and center is the President's health care reform measure that passed 3 years ago, being implemented. October 1, many of its provisions, they kick in, become viable, and the American people will begin to feel the consequences, even more so than they have to date. There is no question but what the Affordable Care Act, and as I said earlier, is the most damaging piece of legislation certainly passed in my time in Congress. Not a surprise, I voted against it. Perhaps not a surprise, I offered the first legislation to repeal the Affordable Care Act after it was passed. The House is often criticized for time and time again passing legislation to repeal or defund the Affordable Care Act. And yet, if you believe that it's so damaging to the country, isn't that our responsibility to do everything within our power to change the policies of Washington, D.C.? And so we have before us tomorrow the opportunity to defund the Affordable Care Act. The vote, those who count votes around here say that's not going to happen. It's a lost cause. But it's important for us to do everything we can to make certain that the consequences that are so damaging to America and to Americans are avoided. For most of my time in the House of Representatives and now the United States Senate, I've chaired the Rural Health Care Coalition. I care about the access to health care by citizens across our country who happen to live in rural or core centers of cities, the urban areas of our country, high Medicare populations, high Medicaid populations. Yet I have no doubt that with the passage and implementation of the Affordable Care Act, hospitals who serve rural communities will be greatly damaged, and we will lose many hospitals. When you lose a hospital, you lose a doctor, you lose the pharmacy, you may lose the nursing home or the assisted living center. Huge consequences to people who have paid taxes all their lives in their employment to support Social Security and Medicare, and yet because they choose to live in a rural community, the chances of them being able to access the health care that, to a large degree, they paid for disappears. It seems to me that the stories that have been told on the Senate floor, and I listened to the senator from Nebraska moments ago about examples within her state and her constituents describing the problems created by the Affordable Care Act. We all have those examples. I have no doubt but what Democrats hear the same stories that Republicans hear. And yet we can't seem to be responsible enough to make the changes. We will have the opportunity to repeal, to defund, I guess is the better way of saying, the Affordable Care Act, and we ought to do it. The focus today and yesterday and the day before has been on Republicans and the strategy of how to do that. You know, the reality, that's pretty irrelevant in the overall scheme of things of how we do it. It's whether or not we get it done. And we ought to be expecting Democrat senators, my colleagues from the other side of the aisle, to be just as helpful in trying to change, defund, repeal, alter the Affordable Care Act on behalf of our country. The focus ought not just be on how we do it among Republicans. It ought to be questioning my colleagues about whether they're willing to step forward and admit there are problems with legislation that they supported. This is not just a Democrat problem. I remember legislation that I voted against that was supported by Republicans overwhelmingly, in fact, broadly supported. Then, after it passed, I was on the losing side, a very small minority. I spent my next few years trying to get it amended. No one likes to admit that when they vote for a bill that it's a problem. But who would be surprised? What American would not think? Americans have great common sense and judgment. What American wouldn't think that a passage of a bill with thousands of pages, late at night, by the slimmest of margins, with no bipartisan support, wouldn't have some problems that need to be addressed? And I talked about how our process here is dysfunctional when it comes to the appropriations process. I heard colleagues earlier this afternoon saying that we ought to work together and that we come to the floor and offer our amendments. Here's a problem. There will be no opportunity for any amendment to be offered other than the amendment offered by the majority leader. So we're saying that we could cooperate maybe to find some solutions to the problems that come from the Affordable Care Act, but oh, by the way, the only amendment that's really going to be made in order is changing the date of the continuing resolution, its conclusion, and removing the provision that repeals or that provides for no funding for Obamacare. This is one of the most important votes that I will ever face, or one of the most important issues is probably a better way of saying it, that I will ever deal with as a member of the United States Senate. How we deal with the health care of millions of Americans has a huge consequence. Economic, their health, their well-being, their family, their ability to get a job. And yet, we are going to dispense with this issue in a matter of minutes tomorrow with one vote on an amendment to remove the defunding of the Affordable Care Act. Wouldn't the Senate and wouldn't America be better served if we were given the opportunity? Again, if there are senators on the Democrat side who agree that there are problems, aren't there issues that we can raise that would allow us to have a debate and a vote and determine where we could find some way to get rid of the ominous, threatening nature of the Affordable Care Act? The senator from Nebraska talked about her examples. It's just time and time again the amount of money that the Affordable Care Act is going to cost, the premiums going up. We've seen the numbers that just have been released for my state of Kansas, significant increases in the premiums for anyone who is participating in the exchange. I've talked to business folks, again, stories of that. I'm certainly a rural Kansan. I care a lot about rural America, and one of the things I've always tried to explain to my colleagues that where I come from, whether or not there's a grocery store in town, determines in many ways the future of the community. And many of my urban colleagues, they have their issues and don't necessarily understand what happens in a rural community if you lose a grocery store. But the conversation with the grocer just within the last month or so was the neighboring town's losing its grocery store. They've asked me to come in and buy it. I've looked at it. I could make money. It would work. I could save the grocery store in the neighboring town. But I'm not going to do that because that would put me over 50 employees and the Affordable Care Act would kick in. Talked to a business whose competitors across the street, they decided to, in a sense, quit competing, at least in one aspect of their business, and share employees so that you now work part-time at one business and work for the competitor the other half of the day to avoid the consequences of the Affordable Care Act. Educators, our teachers, our school superintendents, our enterprises that come together and create co-ops for our schools to provide special education to our students. Funding is very difficult in education across our country. State legislators struggle with their budgets, and yet the amount of money necessary to comply with the Affordable Care Act means there's going to be less paraprofessionals in classrooms assisting students with disabilities because they no longer can afford to have an employee considered a full-time employee and provide their health care. This legislation is damaging to the country. It's damaging to our country's future. It's damaging to the American people. It reduces the opportunity that I believe Americans always have had to get the best health care among countries in the world. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, needs to be defunded. I would say to my Republican colleagues, we then have a responsibility to have a solution, a plan. Our health care system is not perfect. We have the opportunity to present better ideas. But that can't happen in a Senate that doesn't allow an amendment to a bill that deals with health care because of the House amendment. We won't have the opportunity to present our ideas or to offer amendments that will make a difference. Now, you could say, well, this isn't the place. The continuing resolution is not the place to have a debate about health care and how to replace the Affordable Care Act. Okay, I asked my colleagues, the leaders of the Senate, when is? When's the last time we've had a bill on the floor that would give us the opportunity to offer an amendment, to have a debate, to offer ideas about how to fix health care? Hasn't happened. And I would predict, based upon the Senate schedule and the time that I've been here, we're not going to have that opportunity. We ought to, as Republicans, we ought to, as senators, it doesn't have to be partisan. There ought to be common sense solutions. There are. It's not that there ought to be. There is. We all have ideas about how to fix our health care system as it was before the passage of the Affordable Care Act, and we need to defund the Affordable Care Act to give us a chance to go back and do it right, do it better. And again, I would encourage my colleagues the next time we have the opportunity, and perhaps that will, I hope this is not true, but perhaps it is only true if we have senators who are different than the senators we have here. One would think, regardless of your party affiliation, the United States Senate ought to be willing to deal with this most significant, important issue to the lives of Americans. Doesn't matter your party affiliation, you care about people. Well, in this Senate, apparently if the vote counters are right, and no Democrat will vote to defund Obamacare, then there is no opportunity for us in the future to put our ideas, their ideas, all of our ideas on the floor for consideration by senators and by the American people. Common sense tells us that you would fix the health care system a piece at a time, and you do it with common sense and free market principles that would create a greater opportunity for more Americans to be able to afford health care. Health care is expensive. Health care insurance is expensive in this country, no doubt about it. The issue of pre-existing condition desperately needs to be addressed. It affects people in their lives. It affects them and their jobs on a daily basis. But no, we're going to cast one vote that gives us no opportunity to solve, to address, to deal with, piece by piece, the broken system that now Affordable Health Care Act provides us. The implementation of this act has been a disaster. No one can objectively look at what has transpired and think this is the way it should be done. No one can look at the consequences of the Affordable Care Act and say, this is a great thing, it's perfect, we don't want to make any changes. Every Republican will vote tomorrow to defund, at least if the prognosticators are true. I expect that to be the case. Every Republican will vote to defund the Affordable Care Act. We are united in that. We need colleagues from the other side of the aisle to join us in the effort to make sure that Americans have the access to affordable health care and that the federal government operates within the limits of the Constitution in providing the environment in which that occurs. These are serious issues. The Affordable Care Act needs to be defunded. And the Senate needs to operate in a way that then allows all of us to come together in that manner that allows us to help Americans better afford health care for themselves and their families. This system is broken. The Senate doesn't function right. Mostly what I knew about the Senate before I came here was what I read in history. And this place does not work the way it has for centuries during the life of our country. Mr. President, the issues that we face are serious. It's not about the politics. It's not about posturing. It's about whether every American is going to have the ability with the Affordable Care Act to take care of themselves and their families in the way that they want to. Promises that were made, easily forgotten apparently, certainly not kept. You'll be able to keep your health care if you want it, your insurance. I've seen so much evidence to the contrary. Your premiums won't go up. We know that's not true. Time and time again, the promises that were made about the Affordable Care Act are broken, and yet there's no will on the part of the United States Senate to change the course that we're on. It's time to admit it was a mistake. It's time to admit the bill is significantly flawed. It's time to admit the federal government is involved in issues that are not well handled by the federal government in one broad sweep. Time to admit that not one size solution fits all problems, that not everyone in the United States is the same, that my colleagues who come from other places are different and their constituents are different and their health care delivery system is different than it is in my home state of Kansas. I would make the appeal on the behalf of most of Kansans to give us the chance to set the record straight, to do it right, to begin again. I ask my colleagues tomorrow to vote to defund the Affordable Care Act. It's time for Obamacare to come to a conclusion. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Wisconsin.
I rise to speak to an amendment I filed on House Joint Resolution 59, the continuing resolution. It's a pretty simple amendment. It simply prohibits that funds be used for a government contribution for the health insurance of members of Congress and staffs under Obamacare. Now, you might ask, well, why would I, as a former employer, want to prevent an employer from contributing to health plans for members of Congress and their staffs? Well, it's a simple reason is because of the passage of Obamacare, it expressly prohibited funds from being contributed by the federal government to members of Congress and their staff's health care plan. I do not believe the President has any legal authority, and I certainly do not believe the Office of Personnel Management has the authority to circumvent the Affordable Health Care Act. Now, I am exactly on board with Senator Moran in certainly wishing that we could repeal the health care law in its entirety, that we could defund it, that we could do anything we could to limit the damage. But the fact of the matter is the law of the land, and we need to respect the law of the land. And as I've looked through the legislative history of the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, it seems very clear of what the intent of Congress was. Back on September 29, 2009, as this was being debated in the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Grassley offered an amendment that was adopted without objection. It would require members of Congress and their staffs to, I quote, use their employer contribution to purchase coverage through a state-based exchange rather than using the traditional selection of plans offered through the Federal Employees Health Benefit Plan. Again, that amendment was adopted without objection. Apparently, Members of Congress at that point in time thought that the state-based exchanges were going to offer such fabulous health care that they wanted to make sure that members of Congress and their staff could avail themselves of that opportunity. So on October 19, 2009, that Grassley provision was incorporated into the Finance Committee's Americans Healthy Future Act. But there was an addition to that amendment made that basically provided for an employer contribution. It says, Section B-II says the employer contribution may be made directly to an exchange for the payment of an offerer. So at that point in time, it was express will of Congress that the employer, the federal government, could actually contribute to the health care plan purchased through the exchange. The problem arises, however, that when Senator Reid actually offered the language for the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act on November 18, 2009, it specifically said that only health care plans that the federal government may make available to members of Congress and congressional staff with respect to their service as a member of Congress or congressional staff shall be health plans that are, 1, created under this Act or an amendment made by this Act, or 2, offered through an exchange established under this Act or an amendment made by this Act. There was absolutely no provision made whatsoever for an employer contribution to those health care plans. On December 24, 2009, Christmas Eve, the Senate passed that bill without any language making no provision for an employer contribution to those plans purchased through an exchange. It was passed on pure party lines, 60-40. On March 21, 2010, the House passed the exact same legislation. But then there was a debate in terms of reconciliation, and Senator Grassley once again offered an amendment that would have provided an employer contribution to those plans purchased through the exchange. It was explicitly stated that that employer contribution could be made, but that amendment was voted down. It was voted down by a vote of 56-43. All but 3 Democrat senators voted no. And in the end, the health care law was passed. That reconciliation was passed on March 25, 2010. Now, what happened recently, on July 31, 2013, President Obama came over here to the Hill and met with Democratic senators because, as Nancy Pelosi famously stated, that we have to pass this health care law before we can figure out what's in it, before we know what's in it. Well, once senators found out what was in it, that they're going to have to purchase their health care through an exchange and that the federal government could not make any payment for those health care plans, they panicked. And they asked President Obama to please correct that. And so President Obama heard their plea and directed his Office of Personnel Management to propose a rule that would allow the federal government to pay or make a contribution to those state-based exchange plans. Now, I would argue that the OPM, President Obama, has no legal authority whatsoever to make those contributions, which is the purpose of my amendment. There will be millions of Americans that will lose their employer-sponsored care for various reasons, but because of the passage of the health care law. Once they've lost that coverage, every other American will have to purchase insurance either on the open market or through a state-based or federal exchange. Their employers will be barred. They will not have the opportunity to make an employer contribution to help pay for those health care plans. The only way a normal American gets to have any subsidy in those exchanges is if their income qualifies them for a subsidy under the Affordable Health Care Act. The only Americans that now, because of this OPM ruling, they will actually have their employer be able to make a contribution are members of Congress and their staff. That is simply wrong. That is special treatment. It really should not stand. So my amendment basically acknowledges that this is the law of the land, that President Obama, that the Office of Personnel Management has no legal authority to make that contribution, and so it simply prohibits funds to be used for a government contribution for the health insurance of members of Congress and their staffs under Obamacare should be prohibited. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the House-passed continuing resolution now pending before the Senate. Once again, the Senate is considering a last-minute continuing resolution rather than regular order appropriation bills. Handling the annual appropriation bills process in this way is a bad deal for the American people, and it's a deal that we have gone through for the last 4 years now without passing appropriation bills and having to deal with a continuing resolution or an omnibus, which is simply a terrible way to run this government. Congress should be passing appropriation bills in regular order instead of waiting until the 11th hour, and I know the chairman of the appropriations bill and the ranking member are very much in favor of doing that and are ready to come to the floor to do that. But yet, once again, we're seeing the majority leader not let them come to the floor with those bills. This only creates uncertainty in the financial market and hampers America's economic recovery. Unless we come to an agreement, the government's going to shut down Monday night because Congress failed to pass a bill that would fund the government for only a few months. And to what end? We'll find ourselves back in this position in either November or December when we will have to pass yet another continuing resolution. This is a foolish way to run the United States government. I was here in 1995 during the last government shutdown. It cast a pall on the American people, seeded distrust of government, and unnecessarily harmed our economy. It was not a pretty sight from either a political standpoint on either side of the aisle or from the standpoint of the American people or the government employees. No one wins when the government is shut down, least of all the American people. We're all aware of the issues that have thus far slowed down the progress of this bill. While there may be differences of opinion on our side of the aisle about tactics, let me tell you, let there be no doubt that we are all unified in believing that Obamacare should be stopped and should be defunded. I was here on this floor a few years back when we fought tooth and nail to stop passage of Obamacare. I believed it to be the worst piece of legislation that I had seen in my now going on 19 years of serving in the United States Congress. And it still is the worst piece of legislation and the most damaging piece of legislation to the American people that I've seen in those 19 years. As the October 1st enrollment date nears, President Obama's signature law continues to face several significant problems. Employers are cutting jobs and slashing employees' hours. Businesses and labor unions are unhappy and want to be exempted from the law. Families are confused, and premiums, insurance premiums, to people who can't afford it in the first place are now skyrocketing. In my home state of Georgia alone, our insurance commissioner has warned us that we could see premium increases as high as 198% on middle-income families. Other states have reported similar increases. So it's no surprise that a majority of Americans believe that Obamacare should be repealed and should be replaced. I remain as committed as ever to dismantle and defund this law before it has a chance to further damage our economy and to replace it with a meaningful reform of our health care system. The continuing resolution delivered by the House of Representatives to the Senate funds the government while defunding Obamacare. It's what the American people want, and it's a bill that I support. I will oppose any attempt by Majority Leader Reid to strip defunding language from this bill. However, while I believe Obamacare is a serious threat to the future of our nation's economy, allowing a prolonged government shutdown would be counterproductive. My priority has always been the well-being of Georgians as well as the American people, and I cannot support a strategy that could cause Americans to suffer unnecessarily. Further harm to our already fragile economy is not a course we should pursue, nor should it be a price that our friends on the other side of the aisle are willing to pay just to uphold the President's signature law. This fight is long from over. It's something that Republicans have been fighting since 2009, since we first tried to stop Obamacare from becoming law. I am grateful that this debate has brought the problems with this law back into the spotlight and look forward to repealing and replacing this law at the end of the day. Mr. President, I yield the floor. And I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
No votes are expected in the Senate today. Majority Leader Reid says a series of 4 votes are expected tomorrow related to the funding bill to keep the federal government operating past Monday, with votes starting at about 12:30 Eastern. The Washington Post writes that top House Republican leaders rejected the short-term spending plan expected to be passed in the Senate in the coming days, increasing the possibility of a government shutdown next week. Majority Leader Reid is expected to strip out language that would defund the law, change the expiration date on the funding bill to November 15th, and pass the measure with a simple majority achieved entirely with Democratic votes. And the story goes on to say, once the bill returns to the House, any move to change it would by necessity mean that the fight over the funding of the government would most certainly continue until at least the final minutes of the fiscal year, late on Monday night. Some news on Syria now. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council have reached agreement on a resolution to eliminate Syria's chemical weapons. Britain, France, the U.S., Russia, and China agreed on a binding and enforceable draft resolution that will be introduced to the 10 other members of the Security Council at a meeting tonight.
senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated, and I encourage my colleagues to stick around. I won't be long. I saw the gap, and I wanted to come over.
Without objection.
Mr. President, a lot's been said in the last few days. I guess the issue is not everybody said it. I'm not sure that two people have been closer to the progress and the process of the Affordable Care Act than Dr. Tom Coburn and myself. We were in it in committee, along with other members. The fact that I'm not embracing a strategy to threaten to close down the government is real important. It's because at the end of the day, you open the government in the way that the statute is there, Affordable Care Act is still there. I didn't come to Washington to embrace strategies that don't achieve solutions. I came here to find solutions to big issues so the next generation can benefit from it. Now, don't misunderstand me. There's no bigger critic in Washington, D.C. than the senator from North Carolina. As a matter of fact, in the committee, I counted 58 votes on 58 times of amendments we voted to kill the health care bill. I think my record stands for being opposed to this legislation. Senator Coburn and I have introduced more health care proposals than the rest of Congress combined. Options, replacements. We've stood on this floor hour after hour during the Affordable Care Act and shared with the American people why this was a bad move. We've quoted individuals who headed the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, their chief actuary, who told us before we passed that bill in this body that this will close community hospitals, it'll increase premiums, it will deprive people of health care. But the Congress of the United States and the President of the United States signed this law into statute. And there's only one way, once there's a law and statute, and that's to pass a bill that's signed by a president that reverses that. So, to some degree, this is 101 civics. It's an understanding of the legislative process. It wasn't the first time I disagreed with something this body done, and let me assure you, it won't be the last thing. But I also understand the way that we change this, and it's not the way we're attempting to do it right now. So, what have we seen in the short period that we've gone through as we've moved up to October 1 and these new exchanges being rolled out? We've seen premiums go up. We've seen doctors retire. We've seen healthcare professionals move from rural America to urban. We've seen the healthcare infrastructure scared to death of what's around the corner. We've seen premiums rise. Boy, if there's anything that's wrong, it's the title of this bill, the Affordable Care Act. We have made health care less affordable for more Americans. Let me say it again. This act has made health care less affordable for more Americans. It's tripled, at a minimum, the cost of a health care premium for somebody 30 years or under. Tripled at a minimum. A group that is targeted for enrollment in this, and they wouldn't enroll when the premium was a third the cost it is today. Now, we've heard people say that members of Congress are trying to protect their own subsidy. Members of Congress aren't going to take the subsidy. We may pass legislation, but at the end of the day, the public pressure will be such that nobody up here will take the subsidy. But if we're going to treat federal workers one way, then treat all of them the same way. Don't pick and choose who, the ones that work on the Hill, the ones that work in our offices, not the ones that are in committees, not the ones that work at the FDA or the EPA or wherever. Let's include everybody. If you want an exchange to work, then you've got to enroll as many people and you've got to have robust competition. Well, the way this is set up, we're going to have low enrollment. And the way that insurers have responded to the exchanges, in my state, we've got one insurer that has entered the exchange to insure the entire state, and one insurer that is representing 10 counties out of 100. That's not competition. It's almost a monopoly. And I don't blame the one that's in all by themselves. I blame what we designed, where we didn't empower states to actually design things that fit their health care infrastructure in their state, where individuals couldn't buy insurance based upon their age and their income and their health condition. We said, no, if you don't buy this plan, then you're going to pay a penalty. We've heard a lot of debate about the process, but we haven't heard as much debate about the specifics of this legislation. It's bad for the American people. And regardless of the outcome of tomorrow's votes, this legislation is still going to be in statute. It's still going to be implemented on October 1. I hope all the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who have responded to the request to call, and they haven't always known why, except they don't like this health care plan, when tomorrow's vote's over, don't go away. The pressure has got to be on this institution to make the changes. Most Americans don't know that we're going to start taxing, or we're already taxing, the manufacturers of medical devices 1.5%. They pay a surcharge to fund Obamacare. We're going to charge in the exchanges a 2.3%, I believe, health insurance premium tax for every person that purchases health insurance. Now you got to ask yourself, if we're going to tax devices and we're going to tax the insurance premiums, how in the world can the price of health care go down? It can't. This is common sense and math matched up. It has to force health care cost up. And that's, in fact, what every American's seeing. Even your employer insurance, if you're lucky enough to still have an employer that's providing it, your health care premium's going up next year. If you're in an exchange, your premium cost is going up next year. Who did it benefit? It benefited individuals that maybe had pre-existing conditions and they couldn't purchase insurance. And you know what the first act of the Affordable Care Act was? It was to create a national pool of individuals with pre-existing condition, and they would all be offered insurance. And what happened? When about 20-some% of them got enrolled, the fund ran out of money, and the one population that this bill was sold to protect, almost 80% of them were left out in the cold with no options. It has failed since the first step. And what I hope is that the American people won't leave this debate and say we've done our best. We haven't done our best. The nation is betting on us to continue on this. Our children deserve whatever it takes for us to accomplish it. But as I started, let me say to the body, our strategy to get there was flawed. I know it sounded good, but it doesn't work. The only way to eliminate a bill that's in statute is to pass a bill and have it signed by a president that reverses that statute. I'm glad we've had this debate. I'm glad the American people are now engaged in it. I don't think this will be the last discussion we have on the Affordable Care Act, and I will assure you that, like I have been before, I will be again on this floor debating my colleagues as aggressively and fairly as I can about what's wrong with this bill and why it should be reversed and why it should be replaced. I thank the President. I thank my colleague from Alaska. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senate